Okay, so we're going to start, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us here for our nonprofit town hall on COVID-19 to have a really good and robust conversation about how nonprofits are faring given the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm Tashini Harrison. I'm ONN's policy analyst. And if you are not familiar with ONN, we are a provincial network of 58,000 nonprofits and charities in Ontario. And we're focused on policy, advocacy, and services to strengthen the nonprofit sector across the province. So before we dive into the webinar, a few technical pieces. The webinar will be about 90 minutes. It might be a little bit shorter. Unfortunately, one of our guests cannot join us. But I think that's okay. We'll probably have another session like this in the near future. So on that point, the webinar will be about 90 minutes or a little bit less than that. And we'll be emailing all registrants the recording and the slide deck at the end of the webinar. So if this is your first time at an ONN webinar and you're experiencing any technical difficulties such as visual lag, we recommend closing your web browser or reopening it. On our side, we know that a lot of people are online nowadays, given that we all have to work. A significant portion of us are working from home. So there might be some lags from my end, from our speakers. So give us a moment, 10 seconds or so to kind of get back up or get back on just during the presentation. So definitely stay with us on the line. And if you have any questions or concerns technical, you could put those in the chat, and our team, Melanie on the back end will be responding to that. And any questions you have for the speakers, you can put those in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session after their presentation. Okay, so before I jump into the full presentation, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So ONN recognizes we are on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This land has been stewarded by many Indigenous peoples for time immemorial, including the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat and Haudenosaunee. That Toronto is also part of the Métis homeland, and that Toronto is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. So acknowledge this, and we are grateful to be able to work on this land and in this place. So I'm going to start with a poll question just to get an idea of where everybody is joining us from. So here we go. Give you a few seconds to go ahead and do that. So we're about to close the poll. A few more seconds. Okay, so we're going to close the poll. So just an overview of where everyone's joining us from. So we have about majority of the participants online are joining us from GTA Hamilton area. About 22% are joining us from Central and Southwestern Ontario, 13% Eastern Ontario, and the rest from Northern Ontario. So pretty good mix. I'm going to go to the next slide. So just to kind of give some background on why we decided to do this town hall. I think it's very important to have these conversations now, especially with what's happening on the ground with the pandemic. And it's important for kind of nonprofits to both communicate with each other, work collaboratively and collectively to kind of advance issues and make sure communities on the ground are, served and supportive and continue to thrive, even with kind of the pressures that we're all facing right now. So this town hall is just to give us an opportunity to kind of sit down, discuss the current state of affairs, reflect and share ideas from each other's experiences, and an opportunity for us to discuss, ask questions, and figure out how we can work together. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. So first we have Sine Dubé from the Alliance for Healthier Communities. We have Rosalind Lockyer, founder and CEO of the Perro Center for Women's Entrepreneurship, and Kathy Taylor, our executive director here at ONN. Like I mentioned before, we'll be hosting a Q&A at the end of the webinar to answer any questions, comments, or observations that come up in the chat box throughout the presentation. So please, again, don't forget to type in your questions or your comments in the chat box. We will be checking from time to time. Let's get started. I will start with the first part of the presentation. So just a little bit of background on what was happening before COVID-19. As you know, ONN put together a survey, our 360 survey last summer, to find out how nonprofits were faring given faring as a result of the Ontario provincial budget. And so we found that nonprofits were already feeling considerable amounts of pressures, but were resilient and were continuing to focus on their missions to deliver and make sure that their communities continue to thrive. So we saw a lot of cuts across ministries, but some nominal increases here or there, but these were below the rate of inflation. We saw that cuts continued to be announced throughout the year that were not necessarily highlighted in the budget. And we saw that, yes, money was received by nonprofits, but sometimes this money was received later throughout the year. So there were significant cuts to a number of ministries, such as Ministry of Children and Community and Social Services, legal aid, but there were also some increases. So 267 million was dedicated to the expansion of home and community care, for example. So we saw a lot of a mix of different things happening at the same time, creating different pressures across different subsectors in the nonprofit sector itself. A lot of transformations as well, such as the competitive process for employment and training services, and as well as the Ontario Health Team's transformation that is still currently in process. So these were some of the things we were seeing, and we didn't know, and we still don't necessarily know the cumulative effects of the changes that the budget put together last year and how that impacted nonprofits particularly. But we know that nonprofits were still trying to figure that out, and we're moving forward to navigate those waters. So the fiscal landscape right now. So with the enforcement of the emergency order and the forced closure, and where possible, for some nonprofits, not all of this is possible, to actually enforce physical distancing measures or social distancing measures, the economic outlook for Ontario and much of the country looks very challenging. The FAO recently reported, so the Financial Accountability Office reported that the reported employment decline of about 403,000 jobs, so about 5.3% in March. We've seen like 1.2 million workers in Ontario who are directly affected by the shutdowns through either job losses or temporary layoffs or sharply reduced hours. And so to date, we've seen at the provincial level an investment about 237 million in COVID-19 supports for nonprofits. Most of these would have been targeted to different parts of the sector, but overall we're seeing a lot of pressures across different systems and across different sectors and in what is our political landscape and economic landscape right now. So in light of that, I'm going to pass the torch on to Sine to provide her perspectives in the health sector, or the health sector of the nonprofit sector, on what's happening with COVID-19 and how our organization is doing. Thanks, Sine.
Okay. Thanks, Tashini. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to ONN for inviting me to participate on this panel. I am a big fan of ONN's work, so it's always a pleasure to be able to work with you all. So I think I'll start by saying that in prepping for today's webinar, ONN asked us to look at the perspective on recent announcements, to talk about the advocacy that the organization I work for has been doing, and then to also just do some thinking around next steps. So I will try and cover those things, and hopefully if I miss anything, we can talk about it in the question period. So as Tashini said, my name is Sine Dube. I am the Policy and Government Relations Lead at the Alliance for Healthier Communities. My focus is on Black health, but I also carry a few of the other equity files in the organization. And during the COVID crisis, I've been working a lot on the Alliance's advocacy and policy files. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the health sector, there are many orders and many acts that have come out under the COVID crisis. These ones that are listed here are really the ones that we have been paying the most attention to, and the ones that have had a deep impact on folks who work in community health in the province. So the first one, of course, is the declaration of the emergency, which was COVID was declared a public health emergency on March 17th. And with the declaration of that, they came a slew of orders and other acts that have really impacted, I cannot say that word today, how people are working and living in the province and how they're dealing with COVID. One example I'll give is one order that came out under this Civil Protection Act, which gives police extended powers in terms of being able to ask people where they're going and to monitor movement. We have paid attention to things, for example, like increased criminalization and increased policing under the pandemic. And we always want to pay attention to, even if there's a declaration of an emergency, how does it affect people's access to health in the long run? So that's one policy lever we've really been paying attention to. We've also been paying attention to, in mid-March, Health Canada put out an exemption, which was around controlled drugs and substances. If you've been following the news, you'll see that in BC, they now have what we call safe supply for opioids. So this is a way of trying to address the ongoing opioid overdose crisis by giving people access to safer options for drug use than they would get at the street level. So this has had an impact, of course, in other provinces like BC. In Ontario, we still continue to deal with the ongoing opioid crisis and COVID crisis. Ontario, unfortunately, now has the terrible tagline of being the province in Canada where the most people are dying of overdoses. This has not stopped with COVID. And so this law, this act, this exemption when it came through from Health Canada was something we were watching very closely. We've also been watching the OHIP expansion in Ontario. And so this was also in mid-March. The province extended care for all people, regardless of insurance or migration status. So people can now access care in the province, even if they don't have OHIP or if their OHIP is expired. And the way that this should be implemented is that people should not be asked for any identifying documents or insurance documents when they seek care. They should be able to get care for COVID and other medically necessary procedures. So that's a really great temporary expansion that's been put in place there. We're also watching really closely the Ontario Action Plan, which came out at the end of March. This was this was about the time that usually the province would have released their budget for the year. But given the crisis that we're in, they really released something which was a bit of a shorter plan, and it was called Ontario's Action Plan in responding to COVID-19. In particular, we're paying attention to $148 million that was set aside in there for social services. This money is supposed to flow through municipalities and then be accessible for folks who are working in our sector. We've also been paying attention to what's happening to temporary or seasonal workers, knowing that COVID is very much a health issue, but it extends to so many other different sectors. And we've been watching for legislation that also protects temporary and seasonal workers in the same way that other workers have been afforded protections under COVID. More recently, last Friday, the province released an action plan on protecting vulnerable populations. We've been paying very close attention to this as well because it also affects responding to COVID in settings like shelters, group living facilities, and it also impacts care for people who are accessing things like consumption treatment services or overdose prevention sites. And finally, we've been paying very close attention to the pandemic pay. So recently, the province announced that they would be extending increased salaries for folks who are at the front, who are in front-facing positions. There was an announcement today, which also talked about an expansion of the initial list that was put forward on April 25th. So those are just some of the policies and laws that we have been paying close attention to. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about the advocacy that we've been doing. So the first thing that we've talked a lot about is the importance of recognizing essential workers who are working in community settings as key people in responding to COVID. We know that as many businesses and public institutions have closed, many community organizations have stayed open. In some cases, for example, where they're supervised consumption sites, that may be the only service that is still opening as everything that is still open as everything else is closed. And yet what we were finding at the beginning of the pandemic was that for many of these organizations, they were not being classified as essential. And the failure to classify them as essential also meant that they did not have access to personal protective equipment and to other resources that other organizations were afforded in responding to COVID. So our advocacy has really pushed for a cohesive response across sectors. We've said that we need something that integrates provincial, municipal, all of those levels in responding to these crises, and something that means that workers are supported at all of those levels and given the resources that they need to do their work. Next slide, please. One thing that you'll be seeing a lot more about is advocacy we've been doing around the collection of race and socio-demographic data. So part of this comes from what we've been seeing in the US and the UK about the disproportionate impact of COVID on racialized communities. In the US, it's particularly been Black folks and Latinx folks who have been hard hit by COVID. In the UK, it's folks who are Black and also South Asian. And showing a really disproportionate impact of the virus on those communities. Stakeholders in Ontario have called attention to that because Ontario does not collect data around race or socio-demographic information. We don't know how the virus is impacting key communities. And so stakeholders have called for the collection of race and socio-demographic data. They've also been calling for the integration of equity frameworks in the new tool that was developed by the province around tracking pandemic data because it really didn't have a strong equity lens initially. There's also Black health leaders in Ontario have worked very hard to respond to the impacts that Black communities are facing, and just saying that disproportionately these communities will be impacted, and we need the province to respond to the issues that they'll be dealing with. Next slide, please. All right, and this is my last slide. So I think one thing that our advocacy at the Alliance has focused on a lot is who are we leaving behind? There have been some really great things, some really great responses in regards to COVID, but there are communities that are being left behind. Everyone is not experiencing this crisis in the same way. And this is something that we have to think about now as we navigate the crisis. We also need to think about it as we start thinking about what will life look like after the crisis? What does it look like to build a world that is post-crisis? In building that world, in building new policy, will we also leave people behind? So of course, we still remain concerned with people who use drugs, who are dealing with both of these major crises, the COVID crisis and then the overdose crisis. We are concerned about gaps in care for marginalized communities. The province has not put forward a clear plan around supports for people who are in correctional institutions, detention centers, and we know that their risk for COVID is very high. So there's insufficient support for these folks. We, of course, are still concerned about people who are experiencing homelessness and outbreaks in shelters. Again, we're very concerned about the lack of a provincial plan which specifically addresses these communities in a rigorous way. And we're, of course, continue to be concerned about the implementation of policies that have been put in place during COVID. Here I've referenced specifically work around uninsured folks. While there was that expansion of OHIP on March 20th, we're still getting reports that uninsured folks are going to hospitals, they're being charged, and they're being turned away. So this is something I think on a policy level we have to think about. What does it look like to have a policy that's implemented or a policy that's enacted, but then the implementation does not match what is actually happening on the ground. So that's all I have for today. I'll be happy to answer any questions after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sine, for that great presentation. So again, we'll move to questions during our Q&A period. So I'm now going to pass the torch on to you, Rosalind, from the Paro Center for Women's Entrepreneurship. Thanks, Rosalind.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I've been a member, or I guess Paro's been a member of ONN for many years, right from the inception. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about what Paro does and how we're coping. And when I say we are the women, and how we're coping through this very difficult time. So you can go to the next slide. Oh, no one there, but I'll just continue talking. Paro works to strengthen women-led small businesses and to promote community economic development, and that includes social enterprise. So we help people access funding. So that's a big part of what we do, is help people start and grow their business and access the funding that they need to do. And we do that through various programs and also our peer lending circles. So the peer lending circles was the infrastructure where we started 25 years ago. We were a not-for-profit charity, but our main focus is empowering and supporting women to build a sustainable livelihoods, really. And we also offer educational webinars and events, opportunities to network and mentor, and of course, counseling and support. So next slide, please. I should mention that since we had COVID dropped in our lives with all the disruption, we were really ready to go online, because a lot of our work was online, because we covered most of Ontario with our support services for women. We had been working provincially, but when we were saying where were we working, we were talking about where we could get in our vehicles and go to the women to give them the support that they needed. Of course, that changed with COVID. So now we're actually working pan-Ontario, and we are getting quite a few calls actually from the Toronto area, and we didn't advertise that we were open for all of Ontario, but I think there's a bit of a gap there, and they've been reaching out to us because a lot of people are very desperate right now. One way that people can get ongoing support for starting and growing their business, we also include wellness in our webinars. Is we have a weekly webinar, two actually, every Wednesday. So if anyone wants to register for those, they can just go email Making a Difference at Paro.ca, and it's online. There's no fee to participate. It's recorded and you can watch it later. So next slide, please. Takes a little while, I think. So we'll stay on this one for a while. Most of my talking will be around what's on this slide. So it's about how are we supporting women and social enterprise during the COVID-19. Well, we've spent a lot of our time pivoting, and at the same time we were pivoting to provide service. We are supporting, we have about 30 people in our team, and they've been all spread out through the province and supporting women online using every mechanism we had, between Zoom and email and go to meeting, whatever, and whatever's most comfortable for the women to use. But it's been working pretty well, And we're still continuing to help them uh, find funding for their businesses. So, for instance, Paro has our peer lending circles. We have grants and loans from 1,000 up to 5,000, and our intake for those grants and loans for our peer lending circles has quadrupled in the last month or so. And the first two stages, they can get a non-repayment portion of their money. So if they get $1,000, they only pay back 500. And second stage, if they get 2,000, they only pay back 1,000. So that actually has been helpful because their circles were already formed, and they knew they could access this funding. We have another program called Biz Growth, where if people have to grow their business, and in this case adapt their business to be able to provide service, they've been able to get a grant of up to $5,000 and participate anywhere from 10 to 20% towards the cost, depending on what they're doing. Now, of course, a lot of our time is taken up. I've lost my slide. A lot of our time has been taken up with government supports as well, but it really differs as to what government supports can help the various businesses that we're working with. So, for example, there's a lot of confusion, and we spend a lot of time with trying to work through the various government programs. For instance, with the CERB, in the beginning, the big question was, can I earn any money? So we've been advocating. We advocated right from the start around that, as soon as it came out, that people should be able to earn some money, especially if they're in business, because they wouldn't know if they're going to earn it or not. So how could they fill out the application? So that kind of thing was really challenging. The entrepreneurs were really, really challenged by rent, and we advocated every week about the rent, and finally they came up with something. But again, there's parts of it that people don't understand about their particular situation, and we try to help as much as we can, and we communicate with CRA as much as we can to get the right answers. But it can be quite complex because there's such a variance with the businesses and the social enterprises. So just to give you an example of that, like Blue Sky Training Center, they provide traditional teachings to other organizations who want to work with Indigenous people or organizations. Well, they haven't been able to do that. So they've pivoted now to do Neebing cultural tours. So that way the leader can have social distancing. And that's one of the ways to pivot. Roots of Harvest is food security social enterprise, and they've of course been very, very, very busy. So for them, it's been how to work with other social enterprises and community organizations to be able to enhance their service. And Horseability works with therapy with their horses on farm. That would be too close. So all she's been able to do is keep up her profile by doing Facebook Live, so that after the COVID, she'll be able to carry on. So the next one is, how is Paro advocating for women in social enterprise, and what is different? Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to all the leaders that are probably listening and working so hard in their communities, because I know from everyone I'm talking to, the work has increased, but it's so vital. What we do is so vital that we keep doing it. Everyone would think, oh, we're working at home, we're working less, but it's not. We're working more, and there's a lot of stress to that, and I think we need to recognize that. So a lot of the time, we're trying to tell women, have gratitude for what they're doing and give them some support and say, hey, you're feeling stressed, we understand. Because sometimes that's all that's needed to help people move forward, and it is very needed. We spend a lot of time identifying the issues. So we do a small survey that all of our team can use as they're counseling women, and we gather the information and we put it together on a weekly basis. And we take that and go from there. That's how we advocate. And we advocate by writing small reports and sending them to the senior management of government and funders and MPs. But we also work within our network. Our network is really important. ONN is a part of that network, the Canadian CED network, the Women's Enterprise Organizations of Canada, the Women's Economic Council, and the Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, because we're the hub for Ontario, and we're on the board for WEOC for Ontario's as well. And I've been with SEDNET for many, many years. So we work on the finance committee, the policy committee, and the people-centered economy committee. And there's a lot of overlap in the work that we do. So by identifying the issues and bringing those issues to all these tables, then we're amplifying our advocacy. And I think that that's really important. And it's an important part of being a leader within the not-for-profit network, and how we do that and how well we do that. And it should be recognized as well. The last question, what will change for nonprofits moving into recovery? Well, I think to start, I would say that we need to encourage and support local and social procurement. When this difficult period is over and we start into recovery, sometimes the small local entrepreneurs, the local social enterprises, and so on are forgotten. And we have to be mindful of where we're shopping and why. And I think it's really important that we support local and social procurement, and we also should encourage governments to support local and social procurement. We have to have a plan for recovery. Not-for-profits now have to think about safety for their employees, and it's not that easy to get the PPE. I mean, in our case, moving back to the center to work and the offices, the satellite offices, we're going to have masks and wipes and a hand sanitizer and so on. Getting the mask wasn't too bad because we had a local business, one of our clients has already made the masks for us, so we're ready. But some of the hand sanitizers and wipes are very difficult to get where I've tried to get them. So I'm hoping that will loosen up in the next little while. But we closed the office to the public and just went online. So we have some time to get that in place, but it is going to be a big thing for organizations to gather that and have a pandemic plan, because that will be really important. And last of all, I'd like to say that flexibility in funding. So many not-for-profits have funding, but they, their funding is project funding lots of times, and therefore the budget lines are they're stated as being for a certain thing and not for things you want to purchase for COVID-19. So we want to encourage the funders, the government, etc., to be very flexible about those funding arrangements and what we can move and spend money from different budget line buckets. Now, what my biggest concern, and in closing, and I would say, I certainly would want to work with ONN on this. There's a high anxiety around the fact that we may have further reduced funding, because the province, hauled back all the funding for social enterprise, for example, a few months ago, and now it's going to be further reduced, I would think, because of their deficit. And if they model themselves after Manitoba, for example, I noticed through my SEDNet membership that they have been lobbying really hard with the Manitoba government because the premier has said that they're either going to cancel or reduce funding to nonprofits. That would be, I don't think they understand the importance of the nonprofits and what we do and how many there are and what it would be like if we didn't do the work. So I think it's going to be a priority moving forward for all of us doing advocacy to push and make sure they understand how crucial the not-for-profit sector is within our province. So thank you very much. It's been a delight to talk to you today.
Thank you, Rosalind. That was great. Now I'm going to move on to Kathy, ONN, our ED at ONN. Just give me a sec with the PowerPoint. Kathy?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our guests. I certainly learned a lot from Sene and Roz already about the impact, the policies, the advocacy of running a nonprofit right now, and we're sure that you all have stories and examples too. So please use the chat function and the questions to share your experiences with us and ask questions that are top of your mind as well, so we can get to those. I've been asked to share with you just a bit of a summary about how the whole sector is doing from our vantage point, learning from organizations through surveys, through weekly convening calls, through emails, phone calls that we're getting from nonprofits and charities across Ontario. One of the big data sources we did have was a survey that we did, a quick flash survey the first few weeks in March when things were starting to close down, just to get a sense of the lay of the land of how the nonprofit sector and charities were faring at that time. Our flash survey found that there were three key themes that were affecting nonprofits and charities. So essentially, we were facing a triple threat as a result of COVID-19. A reduction in revenues, a disruption in our operations, and challenges in our human resources. So those three threats include, a 75% reduction in fundraising resources already, and that was 3 or 4 weeks in March. For arts and culture organizations, 81% revenue reductions already by the end of March in terms of fees and services and event and ticket sales. So significant changes to our revenue in a very short period of time. In terms of disruption of operations, obviously, that is many of us closed our doors. Many in our sector had to close our doors and figure out how to do online services. There are also a big chunk of organizations in the nonprofit and charitable sector that stayed open, that were serving vulnerable populations and had to figure out how to do that from their perspective. And there are still a number of organizations whose services have stopped, many in the arts and culture. For example, theaters are closed, museums are closed, sport organizations have closed their venues, but the work continues, and we've heard some great stories about how they're adjusting, and we'll share that with you in a few moments. And of course, human resource challenges. So some of the challenges have included access to personal protective equipment for those people and organizations that were still serving communities. Shelters, food banks, mental health service providers, nonprofit long-term care providers, senior visiting programs, community and home care support, hospices, quite an endless list of organizations that were still considered essential and did not have access to PPE. Certainly the recruitment and retention of staff during this time, some low wages compared to the health sector, the public health sector, as well as often in our sector, we've had contract work and people have worked at multiple facilities, so they had to choose one facility or one location over another, and access to childcare. It's very difficult to work if you don't have childcare, and for the first few weeks, there was no childcare offered to workers in the nonprofit and charitable sector. So that triple threat has affected all the diversity of our sector, from sports and arts to social services to the faith community, education, and more. But there were some subsectors that had specific pressures. So I already mentioned arts and culture, festivals, theaters. The Stratford Festival, for example, just canceled their 2020 season, and not only a loss to them of $20 million, but an economic loss to the town of Stratford in the millions and millions of dollars. We're also specifically nonprofit childcare has been greatly affected because childcares were closed right off, and there was no way to keep those employees engaged. So those employees were laid off. And social enterprises that were, their revenue comes from sales of fees for services. The irony I think some of us have experienced in this crisis is many organizations have been trying to reduce their reliance on government funding that may not have been stable over the last number of years, and we're moving towards more of a social enterprise model, or using social enterprise streams such as event rentals, meeting space, retail, catering, as revenue sources, and all of those are considered non-essential. So all of those revenue sources have dried up. So some specific challenges for those subsectors. As a result of, sorry, next slide, please. Thanks, Tashini. As a result of what we learned, what we've been hearing, we asked Premier Ford and the minister and a few designated ministers back in late March for 4 key things to support the nonprofit sector. A stabilization fund to provide financial supports for nonprofits, not only that are on the front lines, but those that, not only the ones we consider frontline essential workers, but all of our sector. To revisit our employment standard policies regarding paid sick days and emergency leave, so our organizations have the policies in place that they need to allow staff to recover safely at home. Flexibility measures to assist nonprofits that do get direct funding from government. So there's a big chunk of our sector that gets transfer payments or funding from governments. So to make sure to ask for those agreements to have more flexibility, so organizations can move money from one line to another line. They can carry over last year's money to this year if there was anything unspent. They can shift timelines and deadlines, for example, for reporting. And finally, to make sure nonprofit voices are at leadership tables when government is making decisions, whether it's task forces or advisory groups, as the government is making decisions on services right now for our most vulnerable and for our economic recovery, to make sure that our sector is heard. So we've been advocating for these asks for a few weeks now. We've had much success, particularly around flexibility measures for transfer payment agreements. Certainly some success around expanding childcare access to nonprofits that are providing essential services. And I'll tell you in a little bit about how we're doing with the stabilization fund. So in terms of the both governments, federal and provincial, have provided some responses already to the sector. And some of this you may know well, some of this may be new information. The best source of information for federal government response is Imagine Canada's website. They have a COVID page, and they are updating a table right on the front of their COVID-19 page on a daily, if probably not hourly basis, with all of the federal programs and services for nonprofits and charities. And so just a couple of the highlights. The most recent was a $350 million emergency fund for nonprofit and charities that are serving the most vulnerable. This money is being flowed through United Ways and Community Foundation, so it can get out to communities as fast as possible. It will not be open at this point. We haven't seen the criteria or the selection process details. That's imminent as far as we understand, but it is specifically targeted for organizations that are serving the most vulnerable. So it is an emergency fund for that. It's not a broad resilience fund. Imagine Canada is continuing to advocate, as well as with many of our voices, for a resilient fund at the federal level that would be open to all parts of the nonprofit sector for operating expenses in the next few months. There's a Canada emergency business account up to $40,000 in loans through credit unions and banks. And so that is, nonprofits and charities are eligible for that. There are some criteria that will make it difficult for some of us to apply, such as they need to show a drop in revenue from goods and services. So that may not be the best solution for you, but certainly check that out. And again, Imagine Canada is monitoring how these programs support nonprofits or how they don't support nonprofits. And finally, the third big piece from the federal government is the emergency wage subsidy. I hope all of you are taking advantage of the 10% wage subsidy that has been available since the end of March. It's very easy. You just do it as part of your payroll. We can certainly share more information if you like, and very little criteria for that. The 75% wage subsidy has much more criteria in terms of showing that you've had a loss of revenue over a specific period of time. So that is open today, or open this week, the application form. And organizations can actually do a calculator online to see if they qualify and how much. So we encourage you to do that if you do have paid staff. Again, we know that there are issues with this subsidy program for our sector. It was not designed for us in mind. It was designed for employers. And so although it's great that nonprofits and charities are eligible for this program, we know that many of us did not have reduced funding perhaps in February or March. Our revenues were the same. Our revenue will be reduced in May and June when we don't have our spring fundraising event, or we don't have our conference or services that are going to happen at that point. And this model doesn't take those into consideration. But we do encourage you to take a serious look to see if that's a benefit for you. Next slide, please. Thanks, Tashini. On the provincial front, in Ontario, the provincial government response has been more specifically targeted to meeting needs. So 120 million has been provided for home and community health care specifically, 11 million for meal and delivery service to seniors, long-term care investment, which includes nonprofit and for-profit long-term care. Some organizations funded by the Ministry of Children and Community and Social Services received 40 million in additional costs, and a lot of those were disability organizations as well. So there have been a number of specific targeted grants in Ontario. No broad stabilization fund, but specific grant responses. And there has also been some changes to the employer health tax. There's a temporary exemption for that, reduction in WSIB payments. So for some of those things, if you're an employer or are paying that type of insurance, there might be some savings for you in that regard as well. So to date, those supports are helpful, particularly for those organizations and those service providing those services. But there's still challenges in ensuring that organizations that perhaps have a broader service delivery, that perhaps are not considered a frontline or essential service delivery, getting the supports they need. There's also a timeliness issue. Some of the money hasn't flowed yet, or it hasn't flowed as quickly. So for example, there was an announcement about a social services relief fund that goes through municipalities. And there is expectation that some of that funding will go to nonprofits and charities and communities, but we haven't seen that roll out yet to many organizations in those communities. So everything continues to move quickly. Governments at all levels are responding, but we're still trying to see what the impact is on our sector. And to that end, I know you're probably all survey fatigued. At some point, not yet, in May or June, when there has been an opportunity for all of these programs to roll out, we will check back in with our network to see if these programs have been helpful, to what extent they've been helpful, and what yet is needed as we go forward. So I think we have a poll question, Tashini.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yes, we do. We have a few poll questions for you around the provincial and federal government response. So I'm going to launch the first one. You just kind of want to get a feeling of whether those on the line have actually had access or had the chance to apply to any of these supports yet. So the first one is on the federal government support. give it a few more seconds. Okay, we're going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. Okay, so we're going to close the poll. Oh, my screen keeps doing that. Okay. So what we found is, so about 35% of attendees online have received federal government supports or access federal government supports. 21% have noted that they're not eligible. 41% are still unsure and don't know yet, and 4% have chosen not to. So we're going to do one more poll. That is the provincial government supports. And so I'm going to launch that now. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. So I'm going to close the poll. So 18% of participants said yes. 40% have noted that they're not eligible, while 39% don't know yet, and 3% have chosen not to access the supports that have been provided to date. So that's what we have. Kathy, do you want to, there you go, you're seeing the results.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you. That information is helpful to us and probably helpful to each other to get a sense of where folks are at right now with those supports. So just to wrap up, a few takeaways and a few other things that we're working on. So definitely some takeaways from what's happened so far and what the sector needs is that eligibility remains a key challenge for our sector to access supports at both levels of government. And part of that eligibility issue is that really the lack of understanding by governments of how nonprofits and charities operate, how diverse we are, how difficult it is to access loans, to have collateral, how little reserve funds, unfortunately, our sector has. So all of these issues that have been long-term issues for our sector have really, we're shining a light on them right now as we try and figure out how to support nonprofits and charities and fix some of the issues that have been long-standing. Most supports to date, and rightly so, quite frankly, we know that they need to be emergency focused and targeted to essential service organization. This is a health crisis that we have not experienced before. So of course, the immediate reaction and the first steps are to shore up the essential services that are provided. And so although that's been positive, however, what that means is that we still need sector stabilization funds at both the federal and provincial levels. And for a broad spectrum of the nonprofit sector, that includes arts, culture, sport, organizations, social services, health, and more. There are also another takeaway that we're seeing happen, and this is quite clear in the media lately around long-term care homes, is that there's also a spotlight being shone on nonprofit versus for-profit models. What works in what circumstances and why. So it's a huge issue and an opportunity for us to talk about the public benefit that nonprofits and charities provide in our communities, the difference between a nonprofit service provider in essential services and a for-profit provider, and what are the opportunities for collaboration and a policy response to shore up the nonprofit providers during this time. So that's another takeaway that is certainly on our mind. There has been, the final takeaway I would add is that this has exposed a number of gaps. There's a huge gap in information about our sector. We don't know anything about the nonprofits in our sector because they don't fill out a T3010 like charities do in the same way, and that information is not as public. So it's very hard to advocate to ministers and government to say, you know, this is exactly how much revenue they get, this is how much we've lost, when we really don't have the infrastructure in place for the data. We don't have infrastructure in place for even labor market information, knowing exactly the pay scales, how many nonprofit workers there are, what they do, how many are part-time in contract, to be able to accommodate some of the issues that are arising. So that's the other takeaway for us, is that we really need to help all of us contribute to advocacy around making sure that those gaps are filled in the future. And I think the final slide, thank you, Tashini, it's just in terms of our next steps. So certainly we'll continue to summarize, pay attention to, and update our sector on anything happening provincially and federally. We're keeping our website updated on a daily basis. There's a provincial COVID policy page and a federal COVID policy page, as well as some resources. We are specifically continuing to advocate, and will shine a light on the need for a stabilization fund. We've been supporting Imagine Canada at the federal level, and we will be announcing tomorrow a proposal for a provincial stabilization fund, estimating that the revenue loss in Ontario is 1.8 billion for Ontario's nonprofit sector in the first 3 months of the crisis alone. So you'll see more from us tomorrow, so please watch our space to see details of that proposal, because we know that, and we also know that government supports won't reach all nonprofits. So there are also opportunities to leverage partnerships, collaborations, donations, corporate partners, foundations, and we're continuing to advocate to those players that now is the time to invest in nonprofits and charities. Now is the time to provide flexible funding, and to provide operating funding, because we know what's needed on the ground to keep our organizations going. So our advocacy to non-governmental funders will continue. And finally, you know, we're really hoping to ensure that nonprofits are at the tables when we're talking about recovery. We've already got some great examples of local nonprofits being appointed to municipal economic task force in Chatham and in London and other areas. So we would encourage you at the local level. Most municipalities are setting up municipal economic task force and recovery tables. You know, get on there and ensure that there are leaders in the nonprofit sector that are there in your communities. We will advocate for your voices to be heard at the provincial and federal levels as well, because our sector is an incredibly important part of the economy, and we want to make sure our voices are heard. So that kind of wraps up sort of from the sector perspective. And I think we're going to turn it back to Tashini. We'd love to hear your stories, your experiences, and your questions. So please use the chat for that. And also you can certainly contact us at any time.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Rosalind. And thank you, Sine, for your wonderful presentations and for tying that all together and showing us kind of the different levels and different areas the sector is feeling the impact, and what kind of the points of alignment are, and where we can, as a sector, work together to actually change and transform, hopefully, the systems that we're in to do something better, and build something different, and something that really does take into consideration the communities that we serve in a way, and our organizations that do this work in a way that's really helpful as we go forward. So we have a few questions, a lot of questions. I really love some of the points everybody brought together around, like, say, the flexibility around funding, Rosalind's point about social procurement, Sinead's point around data, socio-demographic data, and Kathy's point to that around, like, just generally having data across those lines in terms of labor market information. So there's some big pieces where we're seeing a lot of gaps where nonprofits need support and need government to take kind of really decisive decisions, and making sure that nonprofits across the sector, whether it be health, social enterprise, or just writ large, are in that space to make sure that we're designing and we're creating frameworks that are sustainable for all our organizations and communities. So I'm going to start with Sine. So we're going to take a question from the participants online. So Sine, the question for you is, nonprofit frontline workers are essential, but also some of the worst pay. And I think this is generally for everyone as well. We could talk about that. There's a big conversation around decent work that's happening as well. So Nonprofit frontline workers are essential, but also some of the worst paid. What programs, if any, help them or supplement their pay? The person who asked the question is thinking about like PSWs or drop-in staff, for example. So kind of what's happening in that space.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think a quick answer would be, yeah, that's absolutely right, and it's not a good situation in terms of how people are paid. So we know that even with the pandemic pay legislation that was released, the list of who was going to get this pandemic pay was initially much shorter than it is right now. So initially, it didn't even include some folks who are working in mental health and addictions. It didn't include first responders, paramedics. And so people had to go back to the table and say that these are essential workers. These are the folks who are working right in front-facing organizations. They are the ones who are providing critical support in terms of COVID response, and they should be compensated well for their work. And I think that so I think there will be some movement with making sure that people are able to access pandemic pay. But I think the bigger issue will really be, how do we ensure that this is not something we lose? Because my sense is that we're going to have other COVIDs, we're going to have other crises, and we need to be able to maintain these workers with decent wages. So I would also recommend that people really support the work of the Decent Work and Health Network. They have done some really phenomenal work in terms of making sure that workers are compensated well in the health sector. They also have been doing a tremendous amount of advocacy during this campaign, during this crisis around sick days. So you'll remember that we used to have legislation for sick days in Ontario that was then repealed. They have been doing tremendous work on that everyone should have access to those sick days so that we can ensure that people are able to work. And I would hope that Liz, even as you start speaking about, sorry, not Liz, Kathy, as you start speaking about municipal economic recovery tables, I think that again points to the importance of having different people at those tables. So we need people who can come from the health sector and say that this is the economic consideration that we need to think about in terms of investing in the long term for our health sector.
Yeah. Kathy, I was going to ask about decent work and how we can continue driving that as we see what's kind of been coming to the rising to the top, essentially, around the issues we're seeing around pay.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, decent work means decent pay, and there's no doubt that our sector has not kept up in terms of paying staff appropriately in all sectors, not just social services, but in many other sectors, sports, arts, etc. So I think this does shine a light on that. I too am very concerned, like Sane, that this would be, short term for 3 months. It's not like these jobs aren't hard all the time. It's not like there is not risk every day of the year in these positions. And so we really need to, perhaps collectively set some baselines. We need to challenge our boards and our funders to say, we are not going to pay less than X dollars, because we simply can't. It's not fair to our workers. We can't retain and recruit staff for those levels. We're not paying them living wages. And it's going to take all of us, I think, to stand up and fight for that, and to take some ownership and control over that. But I think that the challenge with the pandemic pay is that it's short term. It's only till June, and then those workers the pandemic will still be around in the summer and fall, and it's not a whole list of, it's not an exhaustive larger list of who needs it. So the issue around pay is going to be a long-term issue, and we need to come up with some creative solutions now and going forward. And our decent work team is working on it, but we'd love your ideas.
Mm-hmm. Rosalind, do you have any insights on the issue around pay and how we go forward?
Well, I would agree with what the my other two associates have said, and my fear is that they will go back. And I mean, the $4 increase was really nothing because they were making so little, that I think there's room in our society, given that Canada is a relatively wealthy country, that level of pay for our workers should always be there. And I think, you know, I'd be pleased to advocate for that.
Thank you. So I'm going to go on to a question on funding. So nonprofits are losing many of their core funding sources such as fundraising from events. Does ONN have enough information and data on this issue in order to advocate for us? That's one of the questions. Or do we need to provide more data or on the ground stories? So I think they're asking how can we kind of build the momentum around that and make sure we're advocating for things like the flexible funding arrangements and more core funding going forward.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and absolutely, you know, I think that the things that we're hearing about all the time are funding, staffing our communities, right? So, you know, those triple concerns that our sector has in our work. Definitely, we have some data that show that and we have other sources of data as well that show the reduction in funding levels, particularly unrestricted funding like you would get from a fundraising event or sales of goods or services. So we do have some data. It's not enough. We'd love some stories, like some really concrete, my budget is X, we lost Y, here's how we're facing it. That's going to be really helpful to us, because the more that we can tell those stories, the better. A great example, lately you may have seen that YMCAs are sharing a lot of information about, you know, they've laid off 70% of their staff across Canada, how much revenue they've lost because of the childcare and gym closures, which are social enterprises, and the effect that has on communities. So more stories like that would be helpful. What I'm excited maybe is not the right word. What I'm feeling positive about is that our non-governmental funders, foundations particularly, both corporate and family foundations, we are seeing more flexible funding. We're seeing more going to operating expenses, less project funding during this period. So it kind of shows that it can be done, and it shows that where the messages we've had about overhead and more flexible funding are resonating right now in this crisis. So certainly we need to pressure that to keep that going past this crisis. And there's some great voices in philanthropy that are leading the way on that, which will be you know, mobilizing their voices. But for sure, share as much as you can with us.
General question, I think maybe even in your everyone around the table can answer in terms of for their subsectors. Do you have a sense of how provincial government funding to nonprofits has been impacted? Are they continuing on course on pre-COVID funding arrangements and plans, or pulling back on agreements? So some questions. So I don't know, Kathy, you want to start with that, and then Sine, and then Rosalind?
Sorry, Tashini, you cut out a little bit. Can you repeat the question?
Okay. Yes, I can repeat the question. So the participants wondering, do you have a sense of how provincial government funding to nonprofits has been impacted? And are they continuing on their course? And I think they're referring to the government. Are they continuing on their course on pre-COVID funding arrangement plans, or are they pulling back on agreements? So kind of what are we seeing in the funding landscape, and how is it affecting nonprofits' overall health sector, as well as what's happening in the social enterprise space?
So I can speak to what we've heard so far, and from our survey results, that provincial funding is fairly stable, actually. Most of the funding agreements from 2019-2020 fiscal year have rolled over to 2020-2021, not really with increases, but at the same level. There has not been, we haven't seen any examples of those being cut. So that's been fairly seamless in terms of rollover. That doesn't include project funding though. So, you know, project funding that the government might have been providing that was one time, with perhaps another option to renew, or having another pot of project funding coming out, like a Celebrate Ontario grant, or, you know, specific project funding. We're not seeing new project funding pots being announced, probably because the money is going into other places. So we suspect that there'll be less project funding available in the short and medium terms going forward. But for those organizations that get transfer payment agreements for services, they've generally been stable from our survey results. But I'd love to hear from Sine's network and Rosalind's network about what that's like on the ground.
Mm-hmm. So I can go. My understanding is that, as Kathy has said, a lot of that funding either has stayed the same or rolled over into 2019. I think one thing that's been positive is some flexibility that the province has had in how folks can spend some of the funding they had at the end of the year. So, for example, we know that with consumption treatment sites or the supervised injection facilities, many of those are located in community health centers. And what happened is that as food banks started to shut down, as all of these services started to shut down, people were coming to the centers and they were hungry and they didn't have anywhere else where they could go. The great thing that the province did was to allow those centers to use funding that had been allocated for something else to support that work. So to be able to say you can run a food bank or you can have food for folks who are coming into your center. So I think that that's really been a great thing in terms of flexibility. From the health sector, I think that we generally are very concerned about post-COVID. There's some big things that we were hoping to work on this year. So for example, pharmacare. Which was a big part of the mandate at the federal level, right? And even dental care expanding beyond what we have for seniors and for folks under 18 in this province. So I think that there's not a lot of clarity on what funding will look like in the future, but there's definitely concerns about have we lost the opportunity to work on all of those things given the devastation, honestly, that this crisis is going to leave in its wake.
Rosalind, any insights on funding?
Well, we're in the business development and social enterprise sector. So we found that where we had funding for it's project funding for 2 to 3 years, where in the past with the province, if you there was no flexibility around moving funding from one year to the other. They did contact us and ask us if we wanted to do that this year, and so you know, organizations across the province had that option, which was, it shouldn't be there anyway. It just doesn't make sense because it forces people to pay, you know, to spend money within a time frame where it might be better if you've got a 3-year project. It's better to use the money as you need the money over the 3-year basis. So I hope they will not go back after this to that inflexibility because it made no sense. The other thing I can say is that we didn't expect the Women's Center funding through Women's Issues to be funded. We had to advocate for that. All the women's centers that were impacted, we advocated together around that, and it was renewed. But it was right at that cusp of when we knew about COVID and all the restrictions. So if it had been a little bit later, I think it would have been more difficult to get the renewal. But you know, I think the advocacy is really important, and all of us need to put our heads together when we feel that our funding is going to be canceled and we get any knowledge of that, we have to reach out to the organizations and take the time to collaborate on our advocacy, because I think it makes a lot of difference. On top of that, I think we need to write our emails and, you know, make our calls to government and our senior funders like that we usually deal with and say, these are our challenges, you know, this is why we're needed. And because otherwise you're not top of mind. You know, not-for-profits sometimes are not top of mind, and we have to keep them top of mind.
Thank you. So I have a general question around, like, in terms of recovery, what do you think the role of nonprofits could be? We're seeing that a lot of conversations going around about this is a she session, so issues about decent work for women and care work particularly. So kind of what's the nonprofit's role as we kind of go forward? What are those steps that we have to take, or what should we be thinking about? I know you alluded to it throughout your presentation, but maybe what are like some top 3 concrete things that you're thinking about right now that you could talk about in regards to our role as nonprofits, given that it's a woman majority sector? What does that look like, and what can we be doing or be thinking about? So who wants to take the first?
I
All right.
can.
Okay,
Okay,
you go,
we're all
Rob.
jumping. Okay. You know, I think advocacy for universal quality childcare during this pandemic, there's been a lot of concern. First of all, how our workers, right? First of all, it was only today that the child care workers got the increase for the $4, which, they should have been included right from the beginning. They're open to provide an essential service to our workers in the hospitals and so on. But I think the importance of childcare, you know, from that perspective for essential services, but also the fact that people cannot work if you don't have a good quality universal childcare program in Canada. People can't work. We can't be as productive as we could be. We need to know our children are cared for. And I mean, my children and grandchildren are both, they're all grown now, but I know through my lifetime, how challenging it has been. And in 2020, I don't think it's okay. I think we really need to ensure that our children, it's not only about the childcare, because it's the early childhood education piece of that as well, which is really important and vital. And I know the province had made some steps towards doing better in that area, but I don't think we're there yet. And, within that, I think every organization, uh, all the not-for-profits, everyone needs a pandemic plan. I mean, most of us had something in place, but it seems to me this sort of thing is going to increase, and we need to work on it. And if you have a plan, you don't have to go to your board and ask this or that, because it's there. And also your staff, they know what they're supposed to do and what the procedures are. It makes it so much easier. So I think that that's something that we can put forward to our not-for-profits and help them with, because then I think it can help them into recovery as well.
Kathy?
Yeah, such a great question. I mean, I think fundamentally we need to think about that recovery, a health recovery and an economic recovery needs to include all of us. So everyone in our communities, our most vulnerable, our businesses, our not-for-profits, those that are working, those that are not working. And so I think that this really has shone a light on the equity issues around, who we're serving and how we're serving it. So I think first and foremost, having a principle that when our sector thinks about the economic and social recovery, it's with everyone in mind. In that respect, I mean, I think there's probably 2 or 3 areas that our sector has a voice in. The future of work is the nonprofit sector. We are the care economy. Our sector is actually going to grow while other sectors shrink anyway. We knew this even before this crisis. So really being able to focus on the care work, the decent work in our sector, if we're going to be the future of work, we need to make sure it's good work. And with 80% of our sector being women, that we treat women well, we have childcare, we have all of those things in place. And I think finally for me, thinking about how we put those infrastructure pieces in place, like data and money, those are the 2 that come to mind, funding and data. And Sunny, I just want to shout out to you for all of your work on equity-based data. And I know you were on TVO last night, so congratulations for that. Those 2 pieces we've woefully behind. Data about the sector, data about who we serve, data about all of the things that affect the people we serve. So I think that's part of, for our sector, that's part of our economic recovery.
Yeah, I think I would really echo what everyone else has said. I totally agree. I really like that thinking, Kathy, that the nonprofit is the sector that will actually grow. And so we do need to be thinking about this. I'm thinking about something my colleague, Dr. Kate Mulligan, said, which was talking about the normal killing us. And that if anything, this pandemic has shown us that we cannot continue with the normal. It's not working. And for the next time that this comes around, we won't be able to sustain it. So I think that that needs to be central. Creating systems that work, systems that can actually hold everyone, and systems that take care of people, not just people who have resources or people who fall into certain demographics or whatever. So I think I think a lot of the future planning does need to be in terms of making sure that nonprofits can survive, and that they have the resources that they need, and they're part of the support infrastructure in the long term.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sinead. Yeah, so given that we're close to time, I just want to ask one final question. And again, I'll start with Kathy for this one. What is your ultimate wish for the post-COVID-19 world? What opportunities do you see? So I'm going to leave the panelists with that last question to think about, and then we can close the session.
Oh, that's a great question. My wish is that the work of the nonprofit sector, our employees, our volunteers, the services and programs we provide is front and center in decision makers in the future. The recognition that, oh my goodness, it's this sector that has been propping us up, filling the gaps, doing the innovation, the creativity in our communities, and that's recognized. And it's given us the opportunity to be creative and innovative and continue to lead, and that we have the resources and staff we need to do the work well. And so I think really focusing on shining a light on how our sector has responded to this crisis, how we're surviving, and in the future, how we can thrive.
Sinead?
Yes, I think that I would go back to people keep on saying we lived in this world where we kept on being told all these things are not possible, and then they are possible all of a sudden, right? In a pandemic. So I think that I would hope that we walk away with a vision of policy building that's much more expansive than what we've had in the past.
And Rosalind?
Well, I think experience is key, right? What will we learn from this? You know, I've been around for a long time, and we always thought, well, it couldn't get any worse than that, or it couldn't get any worse than that. And now it's, you know, like the worst it could possibly be. I hope it doesn't get worse than this. But we learn from everything. And it's the learning that needs to be our focus in the next little while, so that we can stay safe and strong as a nonprofit sector. We've just got to find a way to get the message out, because part of the reason why we may be somewhat invisible, even though we do as much, is that the majority of workers in the not-for-profit are women. And, you know, there is an invisibility for women, period. And I think, you know, we're just going to have to try harder on that one. I agree. We've got to get the profile out there, Kathy, and, you know, we've got to do it and do it well. And if we got to put some resources towards that, we just have to do it, because it's vital.
Well, thank you all for your presentations and your comments, and for participating on this lovely, I think, a really robust conversation in terms of a webinar. I think we have a lot of opportunities as we go forward, and it's just making sure, as Rosalind said, we're learning, as Sinead said, to be a little bit more expansive, and to make sure that we're centering the nonprofit centers front and center, as Kathy noted, as we go along what will be a very, I will say, engaging, challenging, and a really important journey for the sector as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to close. Just a little bit of a reminder. So as you know, ONN is, you know, our team is working away at making sure to provide the sector with updates and information around kind of the policy changes that are impacting them. So you can continue to follow us online, as well as look at or visit our resource page. So it's the onn.ca /resources-covid-19 /. You can visit us there. We do have a few upcoming webinars, so keep an eye out for those. We have them, I think, every week until June 1st. So anything to support organizations as they're transitioning to working online. We have like an AG, we have lots of resources as well, like our AGM, virtual AGM toolkit and things like that. So, stay connected. Also, please keep sharing your stories. We want to hear from you. ONN needs to hear from you. We want to make sure we're bringing the issues and what's impacting the sector to the table, and making sure we're including those stories and those perspectives in there. So please continue to share your stories, and I hope that everyone is staying safe. Can't talk either. Staying safe and continues to stay well, and continues to, we're gonna get through this and continue to support our communities as we go forward. So thanks again to our amazing panelists, and thank you all for joining us online today.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.
Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye.